Happy Frazetta Friday, Frazetta fans. In this episode, we're continuing our Fire and Ice Archives series. Last time, we explored how this collaboration between Frank Frazetta and Ralph Bakshi came to life. And today, we're diving even deeper into the people, the process, and the stories behind the making of the 1983 film. Before there were backgrounds to paint, actors to cast, or artists to animate, there had to be a story. For that, Ralph turned to two of comics' most accomplished writers, Roy Thomas and Gerry Conway, and the choice made perfect sense. Few people were more qualified to help build a sword and sorcery adventure than Roy Thomas. Long before Fire and Ice, Roy had already played a pivotal role in bringing Conan the Barbarian to comic book readers, helping introduce an entirely new generation to Robert E. Howard's world. Gerry Conway was equally respected, having established himself as one of the most prolific writers in comics, capable of moving effortlessly between superheroes, fantasy, horror, and adventure. And together, Roy and Gerry took on an unusual task of drawing inspiration from a body of artwork. While corresponding with Roy, he told me that he has been a fan of my grandpa since the comics of the 1950s, specifically White Indian and Thunder #1. While Roy was excited to work on the Fire and Ice movie script, he said a lot of the original writing was left out, but he was proud of the character development and the world he and Gerry co-created. Sadly, Gerry Conway passed away soon after we connected just a few months ago, and his loss serves as a reminder that the history of Fire and Ice is no longer simply film history. It's a living memory that is gradually slipping beyond our reach, which is why these projects of preservation are so important. Speaking with Roy only reinforced Fire and Ice was never the product of two imaginations. It was the result of a wonderful collaboration between many. Bakshi's vision as a filmmaker and animator, Frazetta's unmistakable artistic world, and the talents of an exceptional team of writers, artists, performers, and craftspeople all came together to create something none of them could have achieved alone. While I can't explore each and every contributor today, each one deserves recognition, and many of these stories will be told in a future archival project. For now, I'd like to introduce one artist whose memories offer a window into the making of Fire and Ice, an artist who I admire very much, James Gurney. Today, of course, Gurney is a legendary artist and is known as the creator of Dinotopia, but at the time, he was one of the youngest artists working on Fire and Ice, painting brilliant backgrounds alongside his good pal, Thomas Kinkade. In fact, it was their first professional job. One of my favorite memories of James Gurney's is published on his blog, Gurney Journey. He shared, Frank would come through the building sometimes with his famous friends, and every now and then he would lug in stacks of his original canvases and prop them up around the break room. Imagine being a young artist on a deadline, going to get coffee, and there are Frazetta paintings just sitting there. And that was Grandpa, casual with his artwork that everyone else would have treated like holy relics. Funny enough, Gurney's appreciation for Frazetta only began while working on Fire and Ice. When he was initially hired on the job and was told that he'd be working on a Frazetta film, he put on his best acting face and he said, "Oh, wonderful." But he actually had no idea who he was. Of course, he went home that night and did his homework, and he instantly became a fan. Another wonderful Gurney memory from the blog was him trying to talk with Frank about composition and light through the lens of artists like N.C. Wyeth, Dean Cornwell, Arthur Rackham, and the Hudson River School painters. And although Frank admired all of those listed artists, Frank was not having it. When Gurney compared a spot of light in the forest to Wyeth, Frank apparently shouted, "Wyeth? Forget about Wyeth, this is a Frazetta movie," and he had a point. Fire and Ice was always meant to feel like Frazetta's world. Ralph hadn't brought him across the country to create a museum survey of the Golden Age illustration. He wanted to bring Frank's imagination to life. And looking back at the finished film, it's clear that James Gurney, Thomas Kinkade, and Tim Callahan and the entire art department understood that responsibility. The painted environments are extraordinary, and my grandpa praised them many, many times throughout his life. But recreating Frazetta's world wasn't just a challenge for the background artists. It was equally important that the characters moved like they had stepped out of one of his paintings, and that challenge fell to Ralph. Ralph understood that the strength, weight, and physicality couldn't simply be drawn. They had to be performed. So before the animators ever put pencil to paper, the movement began with the live actors. According to my grandpa, he and Ralph spent a great deal of time with casting director Dennis Gallegos, carefully selecting performers who could embody the power, grace, and athleticism they wanted to see on the screen. A few sources said Frank and Ralph had a real good time finding their live-action Tigra. Finding a real-life Frazetta girl was a dream job for my grandpa, and now thinking about it, it was probably a contributing factor to why my grandma felt so homesick. Live-action performances would become the foundation for the film's rotoscoped animation, giving Fire and Ice a sense of realism and movement that perfectly complemented Frank's world. It was an approach rooted in reality, but one designed to bring fantasy to life. To modern audiences accustomed to motion capture, that might not sound particularly unusual, but in 1981, it was. Before there were digital performance rigs, tracking markers, and computer-generated characters, Ralph and his team were filming actors on a giant soundstage in California, capturing every sword swing, leap, sprint, and fight sequence by hand. One of the great performers was an actor named Sean Hannon, who was cast as Necron. And like James Gurney, Sean didn't arrive at the casting room with an admiration for Frazetta's work. He had no idea who he was. Sean said when his agent sent him the audition, he was simply told they were looking for someone to play an evil ice lord. He showed up for the audition wearing black dance clothes from his jazz classes, stripped out of his street clothes at the last second, walked into the audition room, sprawled himself across a chair like it was a throne, and apparently gave Ralph and Frank exactly what they were looking for, because 10 minutes later, he had the part. Only afterward did he discover who was actually making the film. Sean went and bought a copy of The Fantastic Art of Frank Frazetta, and he flipped through the pages and the realization slowly set in. Oh my God, he remembered thinking, he's that guy? Immediately following the few weeks of filming live action, another team began the enormous task of translating those performances into animation. Heading that department was the director of animation, Stephen Gordon, and according to Stephen, there was really no blueprint for what they were doing. At least not one that made the process any less insane. Stephen had already worked with Ralph Bakshi before Fire and Ice. He was only 17 when he was hired on The Lord of the Rings. From there, he learned in-betweening, then animation, then he worked on American Pop and Hey Good Lookin'. By the time Fire and Ice came along, Ralph knew Stephen could do something this film desperately needed, push the live-action reference away from reality and toward Frazetta. That is the part people often misunderstand when they reduced Fire and Ice to rotoscope. The live action was not the finished answer, it was more of the skeleton, so to speak. Ralph shot the live action quickly with very few retakes because he was not asking the animators to trace life, he was asking them to translate life into Frazetta, not an easy task. Unlike Ralph's earlier films, which often shifted art styles from sequence to sequence, Fire and Ice had to hold one visual language all the way through. Frazetta. Stephen's job became almost impossible on paper. He was an animation director, but he was also keying virtually every scene himself, showing the animators how the characters should be handled and kept on model. Debbie Hayes keyed the Tigra scenes, Bruce Woodside animated the scene with the giant lizard, and Mauro Maressa animated the wolf sequences and a lot of the lava FX. But Stephen was everywhere else, assigning scenes, shifting artists around, and trying to keep the whole machine moving under a brutal budget and schedule. The reality of Fire and Ice was that it wasn't a Disney production. There weren't years of story development, endless pencil tests, cleanup departments, and effects teams polishing every frame. On Fire and Ice, the animators had to create clean animation that could go straight to Xerox, ink, and paint. They had to handle effects inside their own scenes. Stephen described it as more of a fly-by-the-seat-of-your-pants approach, which honestly may be why the movie still has its strange power. It's not perfect, but it's alive. It's got that handmade feel because it was. When Fire and Ice finally arrived in theaters in 1983, fantasy was popping off. Conan the Barbarian had been a huge success, the Beastmaster had found a devoted audience, Sword and Sorcery was definitely having a moment, and a collaboration between Bakshi and Frazetta seemed like exactly the kind of project that should have benefited from that wave. Yet, Fire and Ice entered theaters and largely slipped past the mainstream audience. Despite receiving distribution from 20th Century Fox, the film earned less than $1 million at the box office and quickly disappeared from theaters. Looking back, it's tempting to ask what went wrong, but the more interesting question might be whether Fire and Ice was ever really made for a mass audience in the first place. Critics weren't sure of what to make of it. Some praised the visuals and the attempt to bring Frazetta's imagery to life. Others criticized the simple storyline, the repeated captures and escapes, or the film's heavy reliance on rotoscoping. Despite what the critics said, perhaps the most interesting thing about Fire and Ice is what happened after its theatrical run. Theaters gave way to VHS, VHS gave way to DVD, DVD gave way to Blu-ray, and now, with its new 4K restoration, another generation of fantasy fans is discovering Fire and Ice all over again. And somehow this film that struggled to find a large audience in 1983 remained alive with a cult following. One of the clearest examples of that endurance came years later when filmmaker Robert Rodriguez announced plans to develop a live-action adaptation of Fire and Ice. Of all fantasy films released during the early 1980s, this was the one he wanted to revisit. Since the project hasn't materialized, and I know I'll get a lot of questions about this, all I will say is Fire and Ice fans, Rodriguez fans, never say never. And 40 years later, Fire and Ice has so much more to be explored, and the more time I spend on it, the more I find myself thinking back to that afternoon on my grandfather's cheetah print couch. As a kid, I didn't know anything about production schedules, animation pipelines, box office numbers, or distribution deals. What I knew is that I didn't want the movie to end. I wasn't ready to leave the world behind. I wanted to know where Dark Wolf came from. I wanted to know more about Tigra and her yearning for adventure. Who was the witch Roldeal and what was that monster of a son she had by her side? I've spoken with artists, actors, writers, and filmmakers who helped bring Fire and Ice to life, and I've come to realize that one of the film's greatest strengths is how much of the world remains unexplored. There are entire histories hiding just beyond the edges of the screen, and I think that's partly why it has stayed with so many people. For years, fans have asked questions about Dark Wolf and Necron, about the history of the Ice Kingdom, about what happened before the events of the film, and that curiosity ultimately led to new Fire and Ice projects, new comics, new stories, action figures, new opportunities to explore parts of the world that the original film only hinted at. And as we always say here at Frazetta Girls, we've only just begun. Now, I'll ask you all, what do you want to see from the world of Fire and Ice? Please let me know in the comments section below. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time.